4 friends, a wind-up camera older than most of them, no script that survived to the final cut. Somewhere in Wellington, New Zealand, there is footage that has never been shown to the public, scenes cut not for time, but because the story itself kept changing shape. A 10-minute joke became a feature film almost by accident. And the version you've seen in theaters or on DVD is not the film that was originally planned. What happened to the missing pieces? And why did it take 4 years to find out what this movie actually was? On the surface, Bad Taste looks simple. Aliens land in a small New Zealand town. They plan to harvest the residents for an intergalactic fast food chain. 4 government agents fight back with chainsaws, machine guns, and a memorable amount of vomit. It's gory, it's silly, and it made a young filmmaker named Peter Jackson famous. But here is the mystery. This film did not begin as this film. It began as something else entirely. A short film with a different plot, a different tone, and a different ending. Over 4 years, that short film was rewritten, reshot, and reimagined so many times that pieces of the earlier versions were left behind, unfinished, unreleased, and in some cases, simply forgotten. What we call Bad Taste today is really the last surviving layer of at least 3 different movies stacked on top of each other. To understand what was lost, we have to go back to where it all started. A young man with a camera and no real plan at all. In the early 1980s, Peter Jackson was not a filmmaker by trade. He worked at a newspaper in Wellington as a photo engraver, spending his weekends doing what he loved, making short horror films with friends, using whatever equipment he could get his hands on. The project began as a 20-minute short titled Roast of the Day, the simple story of a charity worker who meets a terrible fate in a small town. That's it. That was the entire plan. A short film. Something to shoot on weekends, something fun. According to cast member Craig Smith, the idea was for a charity collector to walk into town, get captured, and be cooked by aliens, which is where the working title came from. But something was missing from that plan: restraint. As filming continued, more ideas kept getting folded in, and the story grew more complicated with every weekend of shooting. Cast member Pete O'Hearn remembered the shift differently. He recalled that the earlier concept had actually involved a raid by elite soldiers on an old homestead, inspired by British action shows the group loved. The reason the project ballooned into a full feature was simply that the group never stopped generating new material as they filmed. Then, midway through production, an actor had to leave the project for reasons that were never fully explained. According to actor Mike Minette, this forced the remaining cast to expand their roles to cover the gap, which pushed the story even further from its original 10-minute concept. What was meant to be a short film about 10 minutes long instead grew into what became Bad Taste. This is the first hidden truth of the movie. It was never written as a feature. It became one, scene by scene, decision by decision, almost without anyone choosing it on purpose. There was no studio behind this film, no trailers, no craft services, no shooting schedule handed down from executives. The film was shot in northern Wellington over the course of 4 years, almost entirely on weekends, because Jackson and his friends all had day jobs and no money to live on otherwise. Much of the filming took place around Jackson's home suburb of Pukerua Bay, using a 25-year-old 16mm Bolex camera, a camera so old it had to be wound up by hand before every shot, limiting each take to a matter of seconds. The production began at a shoestring cost of around $25,000, funded out of pocket by a group of friends who, by all accounts, treated the entire thing more like a long-running weekend hobby than a professional shoot. Jackson's mother, Joan, became an unofficial part of the crew, feeding the cast, and in one detail that has become something of a legend among fans, baking the alien masks in her own kitchen oven. Every alien mask used in the film was baked in Peter Jackson's mother's oven. This wasn't a production with conflict in the traditional Hollywood sense. No studio executives fighting the director, no diva actors storming off set. The real conflict was smaller, quieter, and stranger. A battle against time, money, and a story that refused to sit still. Actor Craig Smith left the production partway through, for reasons that remain undisclosed to this day, forcing a restructuring of the cast and the plot itself. Some of the footage shot during his run in the film reportedly never made it into the final cut at all, abandoned not because it was bad, but because the story around it had already moved on without it. One of the clearest examples of what audiences never saw involves an animal. In the finished film, there's a single memorable moment where a sheep appears to launch a rocket. It's over in seconds. But that sheep was originally meant to be far more than a one-off joke. The sheep was intended to be a recurring gag throughout the film, aggressively chasing the lead characters at multiple points, according to production details preserved from the shoot. Over the 4 years of filming, that idea was gradually stripped down until only a single moment survived into the final cut: the sheep and the rocket launcher, and nothing more. Why does this matter? Because a running gag changes pacing and tone. A film that keeps returning to an aggressive, chaotic sheep as comic relief feels different from a film where that joke appears once and vanishes. The version we have is tighter, but it's also missing a thread of absurdist comedy that was clearly meant to weave through the entire back half of the story. What's left is a single punchline standing in for what was once a structural device. There's a sequence near a cliff edge where two characters fight each other: Derek, one of the human agents, and Robert, the alien. Both are played by Peter Jackson. The two roles were stitched together through careful editing, using footage shot months apart to make it look like Jackson was fighting himself in real time. This scene is often treated as a fun piece of trivia, but it's also a window into how fragmented this production really was. If a single fight scene could be built from footage shot months apart, spliced together to create continuity that never existed on the day of filming, then the entire film is, in a sense, an illusion of continuity. Dozens of separate shooting days, years apart, cut together to look like a single unbroken story. Understanding that changes how you watch the whole movie. The chaos wasn't just in the plot. It was baked into the very structure of the editing. By the mid-1980s, the project had grown far beyond what a group of friends could finish on their own. That's when the New Zealand Film Commission entered the picture. Toward the end of the shoot, the commission invested roughly 235,000 New Zealand dollars, equivalent to close to 400,000 US dollars today, to ensure the film could actually be finished. This is where the story shifts from a scrappy home movie into something closer to an actual production, and where outside influence started shaping the film's final form. The commission's money came with expectations. It needed a finishable product, not an endless weekend project. That funding is often credited as the turning point that forced the loose, ever-expanding concept into something resembling a structured feature with a beginning, middle, and end. It's worth pausing on what this means. Without that funding, Bad Taste may never have been completed at all. It might have remained an unfinished pile of footage, a curiosity mentioned only in interviews about the one that never got made. Instead, institutional money gave the project the push it needed, but it also meant the freewheeling, anything-goes creative process of the earlier years had to come to an end. The truth was hidden in plain sight for years. The film's completion depended entirely on outside intervention that reshaped its final identity. Jackson was heavily influenced by special effects pioneer Tom Savini, and it shows. The gore in Bad Taste isn't restrained, it's proud, theatrical, and almost cartoonish in its excess. Brains, dismemberment, a memorable vomit-drinking sequence, all built on a budget that couldn't afford professional prosthetics, so Jackson made his own. This wasn't studio-mandated shock value. This was the original vision, uncompromised, because there was no studio around yet to compromise it. That's part of what makes Bad Taste such an unusual case study. Unlike most films where we ask, what did the studio cut? Here, the earlier version of the story was wilder and more chaotic than what audiences eventually saw. The studio money arrived late enough that it shaped the edit and completion. But the gore and tone had already been locked in by 4 years of unsupervised creative freedom. Bad Taste premiered at the Cannes Film Festival market in 1987, selling to distributors around the world. But its journey through censorship boards became almost as dramatic as anything on screen. In Australia, the film had already been trimmed to secure classification. The film received the standard round of required edits and was approved for release by Australia's official classification board. But in Queensland specifically, a regional review board got cold feet. 3 weeks into its theatrical run, the Queensland Film Board of Review pulled the film from cinemas entirely, despite it already carrying an approved cut classification. Years later, cast members reflected on just how unplanned the entire experience had been. Actor Mike Minette recalled that the project's true turning point came when Jackson developed the idea of a group of soldiers raiding a house, a concept meant for a 10-minute short that instead became the seed of the entire feature. Peter Jackson himself has looked back on this era with fondness rather than embarrassment. At the 2004 Academy Awards, accepting his Oscar for The Lord of the Rings, he joked that Bad Taste had been wisely overlooked by the Academy, a self-aware nod to just how far he'd come from a wind-up camera in his mother's backyard. For decades, Bad Taste existed mostly through scratchy prints and early DVD transfers, never treated as a priority for preservation. Understandable, given its scrappy origins. That began to change in December 2018. Peter Jackson announced plans to restore Bad Taste, alongside his following 2 films, Meet the Feebles and Braindead, with an eye toward a possible 4K release. This announcement matters more than it might first appear. A restoration effort means going back to original negatives and surviving film elements, the literal physical strips of 16mm shot on that decades-old Bolex camera, and reconstructing the cleanest possible version of a film that was never treated as a prestige production in its own time. For a movie built from years of scavenged weekend footage, restoration isn't just about sharpening the image. It's an act of archaeology, an attempt to recover the truest surviving record of a production that changed shape so many times its own creators could barely keep track of every version. Whether that restoration process has uncovered any of the truly lost material, the expanded sheep subplot, alternate takes from the abandoned homestead concept, or footage involving the original cast configuration, remains something only Jackson's own archives can answer. What we do know is that the desire to preserve this film, flaws, chaos, and all, suggests that even its creator understands Bad Taste was never just a cheap horror comedy. It was the accidental birth of one of cinema's most unlikely success stories. So here is where we're left. A film that began as a 10-minute joke about a charity collector's terrible day. A production that ran for 4 years without ever really being planned as a feature. A cast that lost a member partway through and had to rebuild the story around the gap he left behind. A sheep that was meant to be a running joke, reduced to a single memorable gag. A censorship battle that backfired so badly it dismantled the very board that tried to ban it. And now, decades later, a filmmaker with the resources of a Hollywood empire quietly working to preserve the roughest, strangest film of his career. What else is sitting in those archives? What did the elite soldiers raiding a homestead version actually look like on film, if it was ever shot at all? And if Jackson himself calls this restoration project a priority, what does that tell us about how he really feels about the movie the world? We may never get all the answers, but somewhere between a backyard in Pukerua Bay and a film commission office in Wellington, a movie was built entirely by accident, and pieces of its true original shape may still be waiting to be found. If you know something we missed, or if you've heard rumors about footage from the earlier versions of this film, tell us in the comments. This mystery isn't closed yet.